Welcome. In this program, we're going to demonstrate the correct rigging procedures for several outboard models. And as you might expect, there are some similarities across the many product lines, but there are also many differences. And that's where you need to be careful. The best way to ensure that an installation is done correctly is to follow the instructions in the installation manual for the model you're working with. Now that also goes for rigging the steering system. We've got single cable, dual cable, and hydraulic systems, and not only is each type different, each manufacturer may also have their own design differences. So you'll also need to follow the installation instructions for the particular steering type and brand name that you're working with. We're going to take a look at the 90 horse 4-stroke first, and then move on to the 2.5 and 3-liter Optimax models. Our 90 horse engine here is going to be rigged with single ride guide steering. So let's move it over there. Note that we have removed the port side lower cowl to aid us in the installation process. So let's start by installing the link rod, which is here. Begin by lubricating the ball joint here with 30 weight motor oil. Then thread the special washer head bolt through the rod and into the steering arm. By the way, a nylon insert lock nut is then installed onto the bolt. The special bolt is first torqued to 20 foot-pounds, then the locking nut is torqued also to 20 foot-pounds. It's important to torque the bolt first and then the locking nut. The next thing is to install the steering cable before we mount the engine to the transom. Now, as some of you probably know from learning the hard way, the steering cable cannot always be installed through the tilt tube after the engine is mounted on the transom. Depending on the design of the transom itself, there may not be enough clearance for the cable to slide into the tube, and that is the case with this boat. Using a little 2,4-C with Teflon, first lubricate the inside of the tilt tube, then you want to lubricate the entire cable end. Once the cable end is lubed, insert it into the tilt tube and install the steering cable attaching nut. This nut should be torqued to 35 foot-pounds. Now, on the other end of the tilt tube, this particular model has an internal seal for the steering cable, so we won't need to do anything else here. However, some earlier models may have a plastic spacer, an O-ring seal, and a cap that you will need to install on the tilt tube. So as we mentioned earlier, just be sure and check the installation manual for your particular model. Next, we want to lubricate the hole in the end of the cable, again using our 2,4-C with Teflon. Then install a flat washer on the end of the link rod with a 90-degree bend and insert this into the hole in the end of the cable and install another flat washer and locking nut. The nylon insert nut should be tightened until it seats and then backed off a quarter turn. We should mention here that lock nuts should never be replaced with non-locking nuts. This is a very important safety issue. Non-locking nuts can work loose and vibrate off, which in this instance could cause a sudden loss of steering. That's going to do it for the single cable steering system. Now, of course, once we complete this installation, we'll need to ensure that the steering system operates properly at all tilt angles before we get onto the water. Now, when it comes to determining engine mounting height, there are some considerations you're going to need to take into account, like engine type, hull style, and so forth. So for more information, you should refer to the installation manual. And QCARE's Outboard motor height and propping video is also a very good source of information. Since our transom is already drilled and we've determined our engine mounting height, we are now ready to mount the engine. Let's begin by applying some silicone RTV marine sealant in and around the holes in the transom. The sealer, of course, will prevent any water from leaking through the bolt holes. Next, we're going to put these flat washers on the mounting bolts to help prevent damage to the transom material and fretting of the metal mounting plate. At this point, we can position our engine so the holes in the transom bracket that we have decided to use align with the bolts. We'll install the two top bolts first, pushing them through from the inner side of the transom. And finally, install another flat washer and lock nut on each of the bolts. We'll just snug these up for now. The other two bolts are installed in the opposite direction of the top two bolts, through the transom bracket and then through the transom. This will help keep the bolt threads out of the water and help prevent them from becoming corroded. Okay, now that all four mounting bolts are tightened, we reinstalled the lower cowls. Let's continue now by pulling back the cowl seal and removing the grommet cover from the front cowl. The cover, by the way, is held in place with these two screws. As you can also see, the battery cables, fuel hose, and the speedometer hose are already routed through the grommet. But since the grommet has specific holes for specific items, we'll need to remove the fuel hose from the grommet so we can route the other components through their proper holes. Next, we'll connect the remote wiring harness. These connectors should have dielectric compound already on them. However, if they don't, be sure to use some on this connection as well as any of the other bullet connectors. Then slide the retainer over the ends of the connectors to hold them securely together. Next, we want to connect the trim wires. These are the blue wire with a white tracer and the green wire also with a white tracer. The black and white and the tan wires are not used on this particular model. Now the fuel hose from the engine already has a barbed connector here, so we'll just connect the hose from the fuel tank and secure it with a hose clamp. The speedometer connection is optional. If your setup does not require using it, simply route the speedometer hose out the rubber grommet and let it hang. However, we do need to connect ours, so we'll cut off the end, then slide it together and secure the connection with stay straps. The next step is to run the battery cables to the battery, and that's pretty straightforward. The red cable to the positive terminal, the black cable to the negative. For dual battery applications, you need to refer to the installation manual for your particular setup. Now to install the shift cable, we'll start with the remote control in the neutral position. Then you want to move the shift pin to the center position to shift the outboard itself into neutral. And it's always a good idea here to check that the unit is in neutral by simply spinning the prop. It should spin freely in both directions. Then with the outboard in neutral, push the shift pin toward the rear of the engine, just hard enough to take up any slack in the engine's shifting mechanism. While holding the pin in this position, measure the distance from the center of the barrel pocket to the center of the shift pin. Next, push in on the shift cable end itself until some resistance is felt. And while continuing to push in on the cable end, adjust the cable barrel to get the distance measured in the previous step. This time though, we're going to measure from the center of the cable barrel to the center of the shift pin hole in the cable end. Then we want to put the cable barrel into the barrel pocket and install the barrel retainer and secure it with the cable latch. Then secure the cable end to the shift pin with a hairpin cotter. Now to check the shift cable adjustment, shift the unit into forward and make sure the propeller locks in one direction and ratchets in the other. If it doesn't, adjust the barrel closer to the cable end. This ensures that the unit is shifted all the way into gear. Then shift to the neutral position and check to see that the prop now spins freely in both directions. If it doesn't spin freely in both directions, this time adjust the barrel away from the cable end. This will ensure that the unit is shifting completely out of gear and back into neutral. Next, shift the unit into reverse and check that the prop now locks in both directions. If it doesn't lock, you'll need to adjust the barrel away from the cable end. And then shift back into neutral again just to make sure the unit is shifting completely out of reverse gear. So again, that prop should spin freely here. If it doesn't, adjust the barrel closer to the cable end and then recheck. All right, now we'll install the throttle cable. With the remote control still in the neutral position, attach the throttle cable to the throttle arm with a hairpin cotter. Then open the cable latch and place the barrel retainer on the throttle cable barrel. Adjust the cable barrel so the throttle cable holds the throttle arm against the idle stop when the barrel and retainer are in the barrel pocket. This adjustment, by the way, is critical to throttle position sensor data that is sent to the ECM. Since the shift cable is routed through one of the bottom holes in the grommet, we're going to route the shift cable through the rubber grommet now. Now we'll move the remote control to full throttle and then back to idle, and then verify that the throttle arm is still resting against the idle stop. Throttle cable adjustment should only be made at the cable barrel. If an adjustment is needed here, refer to the service manual. Now, we've already installed the shift and throttle cables in the grommet, so now it's time to install the fuel line and the remote wiring harness. Then we'll add a stay strap around the grommet to help hold everything in place. Then we'll put our cowl seal back in place. At this time, we want to reinstall the grommet cover with these two screws, and we're done. Now, of course, there are still a few items you'd need to take care of before actually running the engine, but since we're only dealing with basic rigging issues here, we're going to move on to our next engine. Next, we have a 2.5 liter analog Optimax, and we'll be working with a dual ride guide or dual cable steering system. By using two cables instead of one, the dual cable system eliminates free play in the steering system. Now, this system allows each of the cables to actually counteract any travel of the other cable, basically balancing out opposite forces. On the 2.5 liter here, it is recommended that the lower cowl halves be removed for this particular installation. And as you can see, we've done that. This provides additional clearance that will help prevent the shift cable and throttle cable from possibly being kinked during the installation process. Okay, let's begin by removing the 4 bolts from the shipping bracket. These, by the way, can be discarded. Next, install lock washers on the 4 new attaching bolts for the ride guide bracket. Also apply some Loctite to the threads of the bolts and install the 2 bolts loosely in the 2 bottom holes on the tilt tube. Now, the bracket has 1 round hole and 1 slotted hole, and it's installed so the slotted hole is toward the port side. Slip the bracket over the 2 bolts already installed, install the 2 top bolts, and then torque all 4 bolts to 100 inch-pounds. Then insert the O-ring in the unthreaded end of the second cable tube. Slide the threaded end of the tube through the slotted hole and thread on one of the nuts just part way. Then slide a lock washer on and continue threading on the nut so the threaded end of the tube extends through the round hole of the bracket. Leave about 1 inch of threads showing on the inside of the bracket. The next step is to install the other nut and the washer on the tube, about 3 inches. We're going to leave the assembly loose for now. Next, we want to lube the O-rings in the 2 tubes and the 2 cable ends. Slide them into their respective tubes and thread on the cable attaching nuts. Then align the cable ends and slide the coupler onto the cables. Attach each cable end to the coupler with a nut and bolt and torque them to 20 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install the steering link rod. Begin as we did before by lubricating the ball joint with 30-weight motor oil. Then attach the steering link to the steering arm with this bolt and lock nut. First, torque the bolt to 20 foot-pounds and then torque the nut to 20 foot-pounds as well. Now we'll attach the steering link to the steering coupler on the end of the cables using 2 washers and a locking nut. This nut should be tightened until seated and then backed off a quarter of a turn. Then pull the second cable steering tube away from the cable end to remove any slack and then tighten the 2 large nuts. Steering tightness should be adjusted to the desired feel by adjusting these same 2 nuts. Then we'll just tighten the steering cable attaching nuts, and that finishes up our dual ride guide steering system. The procedure for mounting this engine is basically the same as you saw earlier in this program on the 90 horse 4-stroke. So we're going to go ahead and mount it now. Just remember that engine mounting height is critical, so be sure and follow the guidelines in the installation manual for the model you're working with. We'll begin installing our 2.5 Optimax by first applying some dielectric compound to the female end of the main connector on the engine to boat harness, and then we'll want to connect that harness. We'll also apply some of the dielectric compound to each of the 4 bullet connectors on the 4-function warning gauge harness and then connect those wires. These wires, by the way, are of course color-coded. The next step is to run the battery cables to the battery, and that once again is pretty straightforward, red to positive and black to negative. For dual battery applications, refer to the installation manual for your particular setup. Then remove the plastic cap from the fuel line and connect it to the fuel line from the tank. The fuel line is secured at the connection with a hose clamp. Then we'll remove the plastic caps from the oil tank hoses on the engine and connect them to the oil hoses from the remote oil tank on the boat. These would be the black hose and the black hose with a blue stripe. And these connections are secured with stay straps. Now on analog models such as this, the speedometer is driven from a water pickup in the leading edge of the gear case. The black Legree tubing is from that pickup. So we'll need to insert this barbed hose fitting or Legree hose adapter into the speedometer hose on the boat first. You may need to heat the hose slightly so the adapter can slide in easily, and finally make that connection to the tubing from the gear case. If your boat is equipped with a water pressure gauge, you'll also need to make a similar type connection here at the gray tubing. Okay, now we can hook up the shift cable and throttle cables. For the shift cable, the first thing we need to do is position both the remote control and the gear case in their neutral positions. Then we'll need to locate the center point of the slack in the cable. Begin by removing the remote control from neutral into forward and advancing the handle to the full speed position. Slowly return the handle back to the neutral position. Then place a mark on the cable against the cable end guide. Then we'll need to do the same thing for the reverse position. First, move the handle from neutral into reverse and advance the handle to full throttle. Then slowly return the handle to the neutral position and make a mark on the cable against the cable end guide. Then we'll make a mark midway between these 2 marks. This will be the point at which we align the cable end guide when we install the cable to the engine. It's also a good idea to remove the bullet connector from the water separator just to give yourself a little bit more room at this point. All right, then making sure that the remote control and gear case are both in their neutral positions, slide the shift cable retainer forward until resistance is felt and then rearward until resistance is felt. The anchor pin to which the cable will attach should be centered between these 2 points of resistance. Align the shift cable end guide with the center mark we made earlier on the cable and slide the cable onto the anchor pin. You may need to adjust the cable barrel so it slips freely into the barrel holder. Once you've completed that, secure the shift cable in place with the shift cable retainer. To check the shift cable adjustment, first shift the remote control into the forward position. Then check to make sure that the prop shaft is locked solidly in gear. Then shift the remote control into neutral, and this time make sure the prop shaft turns freely. We'll need to do the same thing for the reverse position. First shift into reverse and make sure the prop shaft is locked in gear. Then shift back to neutral and the prop shaft should turn freely. If your gear case does not lock in gear or return to neutral when shifted, repeat the entire adjustment procedure. Next on our list is the throttle cable. Again, we'll start with the remote control in the neutral position. Then adjust the cable barrel so the throttle cable holds the idle stop screw against the stop when the barrel is on the barrel retainer and the cable end is on the throttle arm stud. Once the cable is adjusted, secure the cable end to the throttle lever with a washer and lock nut. The lock nut should be tightened and then backed off a quarter of a turn. To check the throttle cable adjustment, shift the unit into forward and reverse several times. And remember to rotate the prop shaft when shifting into reverse. Then, with the remote control in the neutral position, place a thin piece of paper between the idle stop screw and the idle stop. As the paper is pulled out, you should feel some drag, but the paper should not tear. Tech Services has learned that an additional 2 turns of the cable barrel at this point will preload the cable sufficiently to ensure that the cable returns consistently to the idle stop. So we'll need to remove the cable once again and give that barrel the additional 2 turns it needs. This small amount of preload on the cable helps eliminate possible false throttle position sensor errors. It's also very critical that you do not preload the cable more than 2 turns. This will help prevent damage to the remote control and other related parts. Once the cable is properly preloaded, reinstall the throttle cable and reconnect the water separator lead. All right, we have reinstalled the lower cowl halves, so now we can connect the trim wires and then we're going to continue with the front clamp. Install the lower half of the clamp first. Then you want to wrap the piece of neoprene around everything so the neoprene will be just inside the forward edge of the clamp when it's in place. At this point, install the upper half of the clamp with the 2 attaching screws. And to finish the job, install a stay strap around the clamp in the groove near the front edge. Okay, then a little 2,4-C on all the grommets on the flywheel cover, and we can install that too. Then connect the vent hose from the VST to the cover, and also make certain that the air compressor grommet fits tightly into the flywheel cover. Our engine is basically rigged at this point. Of course, you're still going to need to prop the engine correctly and prime the oil and fuel systems before you can run the engine. But as we mentioned earlier, we're only dealing with basic rigging issues in this video program. Now on the 2.5 liter digital Optimax, the rigging procedure is basically the same as what you just saw. The digital engine does, however, require connecting this one additional harness, and it's used for interfacing with the SmartCraft gauges. The block pressure and speedometer are also interfaced electronically to the SmartCraft gauges through this additional SmartCraft harness. So there are no Legree connections here as you saw in the analog engine. For more information on digital engines, you can refer to the Outboard 2000 product update video. Okay, now it's time to bring in our next boat. Okay, our next engine is a 3-liter analog Optimax. Since the installation procedures for 3 liters are basically the same as for the 2.5 models, we went ahead, as you can see here, and installed the engine. One difference on 3 liters is the front clamp, and we'll show you that in just a minute after we talk a little bit about the steering. This particular setup has a C-Star front mount hydraulic steering system. Now, since there are many differences among the numerous models and types of hydraulic steering, we won't go into detail about any one system. Instead, we recommend that you refer to the manufacturer's instruction manual for the specific type of hydraulic steering system you happen to be working with. We also need to mention here that on 3-liter Optimaxes like this, the lower cowl halves do not have to be removed when installing the shift cable and the throttle cable. However, it is recommended that those bolts be loosened somewhat to allow the cowl halves to be spread apart to prevent kinking of those cables. Okay, now let's take a look at the 3-liter front clamp we talked about earlier. As before, you'd begin by wrapping the hoses, the wires, and cables with neoprene. And there are actually two basic differences in this clamp for the 3-liter. This bracket has been added and is secured by these two bolts. And there's an additional location for a second stay strap that needs to be threaded here in these two holes. This is the top half of the clamp, and you'll notice the second stay strap is located here inside the snout. This setup also has a convoluted rigging tube here that will need to slide over the front clamp and then secure it in place with a hose clamp. The final step is to lube the grommets in the flywheel cover with 2,4-C grease and install it. Make sure that the air compressor grommet in the cover fits properly onto the air compressor fitting. And that's it. And once again, you'd still need to prop the engine correctly and prime the oil and fuel system before running the engine. All right, now on the 3-liter digital Optimax, the speedometer and block water pressure are also interfaced electronically to the SmartCraft gauges. This additional SmartCraft harness is used just as you saw earlier on the 2.5 digital engine. So once again, this would be about the only difference you'd encounter when rigging a 3-liter digital model. Well, that just about wraps things up. Keep in mind that we were demonstrating basic rigging issues in this program. Every application will present different concerns that you will need to take into account. And these include such things as motor height, accessories, steering type, engine startup procedures, and so on. So for that reason, we recommend that you follow the installation instructions for the engine type, boat type, and steering type that you're working with. Reading, understanding, and following all installation instructions will help ensure the reliability of Mercury products. You'll also be making sure that your customer's boating experience is a safe one. We'll see you next program.